In the heart of a grand estate, in a chamber heavy with opulence and festivity, something unspeakable was about to unfold. The candles flickered, casting long, menacing shadows across the floor, their soft light barely touching the faces of the guests. Outside, the wind howled against the stone walls, a reminder of the world beyond. But inside it was warm, rich with the scent of roasting meat, fine wine, and the faintest trace of something darker, something foul. A wedding feast was being held, the union of two powerful families, a spectacle of wealth and bloodlines. The noble guests sipped from golden goblets, their laughter echoing in the hall. But in the corner, unnoticed by most, there stood a girl. Her dark eyes were fixed on the feast, but her mind was far from the revelry. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't even allowed to look at the guests, let alone listen to their whispered secrets. She was nothing, just a slave. But tonight, she had been invited. And the reason for her presence wasn't what anyone thought. She wasn't here to serve. She wasn't here to smile. No. She was here to poison them all, but she wouldn't kill them quickly. No, she had something far more twisted in mind. There is a moment, just before the storm hits, when time seems to freeze. It was then, in that brief pause, that a chill passed through the room. The bride, so radiant, so eager, turned to her new husband. They exchanged a look, a fleeting moment of joy. The guests toasted, their voices rising, but it was as if the entire hall knew this moment would be their last. The girl, trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation, moved closer to the table. The wine was poured. The first toast was raised, and in that moment the future of the entire bloodline, the nobility, the families, the name, was forever sealed. What happened that night at that wedding feast, beneath the chandeliers and amid the laughter, would go down in history as one of the most bizarre and terrifying acts of revenge. A story whispered by the old, feared by the young. The bloodline of a great family was cursed, but no one knew who had done it, no one knew the true reason, and they never would. The year was 1672. The world was a different place then, one of shadows and secrets, where the boundaries of power were marked by blood and gold. In Europe, the empires were tightening their grip on the colonies, while the great families of the old world were consolidating their wealth and influence. In the countryside, far from the bustling capitals, the scent of harvest mingled with that of horse sweat and smoke. It was a time of conflict, a time of oppression, and a time where the lives of the lower classes were often measured in hours, not years. This story, though, didn't take place in some far-off land or forgotten battlefield. It unfolded in a secluded manner, hidden deep within the rolling hills of England, a place where the lines between nobility and servitude blurred in the dark recesses of the estate. Here, amidst the lavish gardens and grand dining halls, one family ruled with an iron fist, the Radcliffs. The Radcliffs were old, ancient even, their name a whispered legend among the people of the region. Their wealth was almost mythic, their estates vast, stretching over miles of land, dotted with stables, orchards, and fields of grain. The manor itself was a fortress, surrounded by towering walls that kept the world at bay. Inside, the Radcliffs enjoyed all the luxuries that centuries of power could afford. Ornate tapestries, gilded furniture, servants at every turn. But for all their grandeur, the family was crumbling. Beneath the lavish surface there was decay. There were whispers in the halls, rumors of debts, betrayal, and broken promises. The Radcliffs had once been the most powerful family in the region, but their bloodline was beginning to show signs of wear. Their name, once synonymous with strength and influence, was starting to fade. The man at the center of it all was Lord Alistair Radcliff. Tall, striking, with piercing eyes and the presence of a king. He had inherited the title and the estate from his father, a man of great ambition, but also of ill fortune. His reign had been marked by lavish parties, extravagant displays, and the pursuit of a legacy that was, in his eyes, never enough. Alistair's ambition was his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. His obsession with restoring the Radcliffs to their former glory pushed him to make deals with men whose names had long been forgotten. He sought marriage alliances with the daughters of powerful families, hoping that his bloodline would become even stronger. But Alistair's ambitions often led him to make choices that would have severe consequences. And that's where she entered. Her name was Elira. She had been born on a neighboring estate, a child of the soil. Rough hands, wind-scarred cheeks, eyes too sharp for someone so young. She was just another slave taken in from her family when they had fallen on hard times. Raised in the shadow of the great manor, Elira knew nothing but toil, laboring under the weight of the Radcliff's command. The grand estate offered no kindness to her kind. She lived in the kitchens, the stables, the laundry rooms, never allowed to wander beyond the stone walls. There were no dreams for someone like her, no future outside of the sweat of her brow and the clink of chain. But there was something about Elira that made her different from the other slaves, something dark. A fire burned in her, one that no amount of scorn or cruelty could extinguish. She kept her head down, worked tirelessly, and endured the vile treatment meted out to her by the lords and ladies. But in her heart, a deep hatred festered, a hatred born of years of oppression, a hatred that would soon manifest in ways no one could have ever anticipated. Elira had heard the rumors about Lord Radcliff's upcoming marriage. His new bride, Lady Isabel, was to come from a powerful family. Their union would secure the Radcliff's place among the great houses of England, a move that would grant them even more power and wealth. The wedding was to be grand, a feast unlike any other. The guests would arrive from all corners of the kingdom, their silver and jewels sparkling in the candlelight. It was to be a celebration of power, a display of strength. But for Elira, it was something else. It was the night she would strike. No one could see it then, but the atmosphere in the manor was one of quiet desperation. Beneath the laughter and the clinking of wine glasses, beneath the gilded walls and the polished floors, there was an undercurrent of tension, an unspoken understanding that the Radcliffs were teetering on the edge. The bloodline that had once ruled so effortlessly was now threatened by the weight of its own decadence. The marriage, the grand feast, was meant to shore up that crumbling foundation, and Elira had watched it all unfold. She knew the Radcliffs better than they knew themselves. She had seen the way Lord Alistair would treat those beneath him, the way his hand would sometimes linger a little too long on a servant's back, or how he would force smiles when his family name was mentioned in the halls. She had heard the whispered conversations in the kitchens, where the servants would speak of how he had promised to restore the family's greatness, no matter the cost. They spoke of his ruthlessness, of the way he would stop at nothing to protect his bloodline. But what the Radcliffs didn't know was that blood, once spilled, doesn't always stay where it's meant to. That night in the grand hall, as the guests gathered around the long table, a plan was already unfolding in Elira's mind. She knew what had to be done. She knew how to make them all pay. The scent of roasting meat filled the air, a heady perfume of opulence mixed with the staleness of old stone. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting the faces of the guests in a warm, golden glow. But Elira felt none of that warmth. There was a coldness in her chest, a steady pulse of resolve that kept her steady. The fateful night was drawing closer. Days before the wedding feast, the manor was a hive of activity. The servants scurried from room to room, preparing for the grand event. Tapestries were dusted, silver polished, and linen laid across the great tables that would soon groan under the weight of food and drink. Outside, the grounds were alive with the bustle of horses and carts, as merchants arrived bearing crates of fine wines, exotic fruits, and spices from distant lands. The world of the Radcliffs was one of spectacle, of grand gestures meant to mask the shadows that lingered just beneath the surface. But there, in the hidden corners of the estate, was another world entirely, a world of whispers, of secrets carried through the servants' quarters like a poisonous wind. Elira had learned early on that the heart of any household beats in the quiet places. The kitchens, the stables, the laundry rooms, all were the true chambers of power, the places where the real decisions were made, not with the pomp of nobles, but in hushed tones. It was there, in the darkened corners, that Elira had first begun to form her plan. Each day she worked tirelessly, her hands rough from the endless chores, her mind sharp with the knowledge of her purpose. She had heard them speak of the feast, of the marriage, of the lavish spread that would be served. And each day her resentment grew. The more she heard of Lord Radcliffe's schemes, of his plans to cement his power with this new marriage, the deeper her hatred grew. But it wasn't just hatred for him, it was a hatred for the entire system that had enslaved her. It was a hatred for all those who had stood by and let this family thrive, while others withered in their shadows. As the wedding day drew near, Elira found herself observing Lord Alistair more closely. She watched the way he carried himself, the arrogance in his steps, the way his hand rested possessively on his bride's arm. Lady Isabel was beautiful, the perfect match for Alistair in every way. She was demure, elegant, and every inch the noblewoman. The Radcliffes had made a strategic choice when they arranged her marriage to Alistair. Isabel's family was wealthy, influential. Her presence at the feast would have been the final seal on the Radcliffes' revival. But for all her beauty, Isabel was as ignorant as the others. She believed in the fairy tale of the Radcliffe name, in the gilded promises that had been spun for her. She didn't see the rot beneath. As for the guests, noblemen, dignitaries, distant relatives who had come to witness this union, they were all part of the same system, part of the same world that had never even bothered to look at Elira. But now they would all see her, they would all know her, they would all pay. The plan, though subtle, was simple. Elira would wait for the right moment, the exact moment when all eyes were fixed on the union of the two families. She knew that with so many guests, so many dignitaries, it would be easy for her to disappear into the background, just another servant among hundreds, unnoticed by all, until it was too late. But first, there was the matter of the poison. Elira had heard whispers in the kitchens from one of the older cooks about a secret recipe, a concoction passed down through generations of servants who had worked for the Radcliffes. It was a poison unlike any other, one that didn't kill quickly, but instead slowly drained the strength from the body, a poison that was undetectable in the moment, but which left its victim weakened, delirious, and incapacitated. A poison that would ruin a bloodline without leaving a trace. Elira's plan was to use it in the wine, to slip it into the goblets of the Radcliffes and their guests during the wedding feast. The poison would begin its work slowly, like a shadow creeping through the body, weakening the blood, choking the life force with every sip. And by the time the guests realized something was wrong, it would be too late. But even as she prepared the poison, doubts began to creep into her mind. Was this the right course of action? Was there another way? Would this truly bring the justice she so desperately sought? She could not help but wonder if there was a part of her that longed not for vengeance but for something more, a desire to break free from the chains that had bound her for so long. At night, alone in her tiny room in the servants' quarters, she would lie awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the manor, the creak of the old wood, the faint murmur of the night wind, the distant laughter of the nobles in the grand hall as they celebrated their power and wealth. Her decision had already been made, but still, doubt lingered in the corners of her mind like a dark cloud. The voices of those who had suffered alongside her whispered to her too, reminding her of the years of toil, the injustice, the pain that had been her lot in life. They had all been forgotten. They had all been overlooked. But she would make them remember. The day of the feast arrived at last, and with it the final preparations. The grand hall was transformed into a spectacle of opulence. The long table was laid with gold and silver, its surface gleaming in the light of hundreds of candles. Platters of roasted meats, dishes of exotic fruits, bowls of creamy sauces and fragrant herbs, all were arranged meticulously, designed to show off the wealth and power of the Radcliffes. Servants moved among the guests, offering wine and delicacies. The guests laughed, their voices rising in a chorus of indulgence. Elira moved among them unnoticed, her eyes scanning the room for the perfect moment. She knew the poison would take time to work, hours perhaps. So the key was to start small, to make sure no one suspected anything until it was too late. As the night wore on, the wine flowed freely. Lord Alistair raised his goblet to his new bride, and the guests toasted to the health of their family and the future of the Radcliffs. Elira watched, her heart pounding, as the bride sipped her wine, as Lord Alistair clinked his glass against the others. The first toast had been made, but it was not the end. The plan had only just begun. The candles had been burning for hours, their flickering flames casting ghostly shadows against the grand walls of the Radcliff Manor. The guests had grown louder, their laughter more boisterous as the wine flowed in rivers. The feast had entered its most decadent stage, with everyone eagerly discussing the future, the wealth of the Radcliffs, and the greatness that would follow this marriage. The clinking of goblets filled the air, but beneath it there was a strange tension, a heavy feeling as if something was about to shatter the glassy calm. Elira moved through the hall with an almost predatory grace, her eyes sweeping over the guests. She had been invisible to them for so long, just another servant, but tonight she was different. Tonight, she was the architect of their fate, and no one could see it. Not yet. She stood near the long table, behind the guests who were too drunk to notice the shift in the air. Lord Alistair sat at the head, his fingers brushing against Lady Isabel's delicate wrist as she smiled at him, oblivious. He was holding his goblet with an air of command, as though his very presence made the celebration complete. His voice was rich, deep, and full of authority as he spoke to those around him. But Elira's eyes were on him, on the man who had not just enslaved her, but countless others like her, the man who was about to lose everything. As the feast wore on, Elira began to feel the first stirrings of satisfaction. The poison she had so carefully laced into the wine had already begun its work. It had started small, just a slight tingle at the back of the throat, a quiet nausea that would grow over time, but no one would know. Not yet. The guests were drunk, too caught up in the festivities to notice the creeping illness that was slowly spreading among them. The first to fall was Sir Reginald, an old ally of Lord Radcliffe, a man whose face was flushed from the wine. He clutched at his chest, his breath shallow, his skin pale as death. He muttered something incoherent, his hands shaking as he reached for his goblet, but his eyes rolled back into his head before he could take another sip. His body went slack and he slumped forward, sending his goblet crashing to the ground with a sickening clatter. For a moment, the room went silent. The sudden stillness was only broken by the frantic cries of the servants who rushed to his side. But Sir Reginald didn't stir. His eyes remained wide open, frozen in an expression of horror. His lips parted as though he had tried to scream but never had the chance. The other guests looked at him, confusion slowly turning to concern, and then to fear as they realized something was very wrong. At that very moment, Lord Alistair rose to his feet, his voice booming across the hall. "What is this?" His eyes scanned the guests, his face contorted with confusion. "Someone, help him!" But it was already too late. Another guest, a distant cousin of the Radcliffs, suddenly doubled over in his chair, clutching at his stomach. His breath came in desperate gasps, his face contorted in pain. Then, as though the poison was taking hold of his very soul, he fell back, his body going limp. His wine-stained lips trembled, and his chest rose and fell in uneven bursts. But no one could help him. His eyes, too, remained open in an eternal, silent scream. Panic spread like wildfire. The air had grown thick with confusion, fear, and the unmistakable scent of something foul. The guests, now aware that something terrible was unfolding, scrambled from their seats, their elegant clothes rustling as they rushed for the doors, knocking over chairs and goblets in their haste. But there was no escape. The poison had already begun to work its terrible magic. Elira, still hidden in the shadows, watched with a strange, detached satisfaction as the chaos unfolded. The atmosphere had shifted from joy to terror in a matter of minutes. The laughter was gone, replaced by the gasps of disbelief and the frantic footsteps of those who feared they too might fall victim to whatever was plaguing them. The Radcliffs were beginning to feel it now, their bloodline being torn apart, one guest at a time. And yet the poison would not show itself clearly, not until the very end. Lord Alistair, his face pale and his hands shaking, stood over Sir Reginald's body, the fear creeping into his features for the first time that night. "What in God's name is happening?" he asked aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. But it wasn't God's doing. It was Elira's. The guests who had fallen continued to writhe, some of them now on the floor, convulsing as the poison slowly coursed through their veins. The smell in the room had shifted, from the heady aroma of rich food to something altogether darker. The scent of rot, of sickness, filled the air. Elira could hear it now, the slow, labored breathing of those still struggling against the poison. Then, the screams began. A woman, her face twisted with agony, shrieked as her body contorted unnaturally, her hands clutching at her throat, her knees buckling beneath her. She collapsed onto the floor, her limbs splayed out as if her body had been broken by invisible hands. The guests around her backed away in horror, unsure whether to flee or to help. It was chaos. But for Elira, it was a symphony. She stayed in the shadows, her heart pounding with every moment, her pulse racing with anticipation. There was no turning back now. The guests who had so long ignored her, who had never even considered her humanity, were now witnessing the power she had over them. They were seeing, for the first time, the force of her fury. Lord Alistair's eyes were frantic now. His gaze darted from one lifeless body to the next, his breath coming in short, erratic bursts. His hands, trembling, grasped the edge of the table as he sought to steady himself. "What is happening?" he muttered again, his voice breaking. "Who did this? Who dares to—" His words were cut short by a violent spasm in his chest. He staggered back, his hand clutching at his heart. His breath was ragged now, his face contorted in disbelief as the poison worked its way through his system. It wasn't the poison alone that struck fear into his heart. It was the realization. He understood now, in the darkest corner of his mind, that this wasn't an accident. This wasn't some plague. No, this was a carefully crafted revenge, a punishment for his sins, a punishment he had never seen coming. "Elira," he whispered, the name barely escaping his lips. The word hung in the air like a curse, a final confession. At last, the man who had spent his entire life in control, whose name had commanded respect and fear for generations, collapsed to the floor. His body jerked as if struck by an invisible hand, his once strong form now weak and vulnerable. The terror in his eyes was the last thing to fade before he fell still. The room was silent now. The guests were either dead, dying, or too far gone to move. The stench of death filled the hall, and amidst it all, Elira stood, her eyes cold, her heart still. The bloodline of the Radcliffs, once mighty and proud, had been poisoned at the very root. The family was finished. The manor was deathly silent. The grand hall, once vibrant with life, now stood in a sickening stillness. The flickering candlelight cast long, distorted shadows against the walls, making the room appear as if it were a haunted reflection of its former self. The scent of rich food and wine had been replaced by something far more ominous, the pungent stench of decay, mingled with the metallic tang of blood. The once pristine floors, now slick with spilled wine, the bodies of the fallen and the frantic scramble of those still alive, were stained with the price of vengeance. The poison had worked faster than Elira had anticipated. Perhaps she had underestimated the strength of her own will, the resolve with which she had sealed the fate of the Radcliffe family. The legacy of the Radcliffs, once grand and powerful, was now reduced to little more than a smattering of corpses and the echoes of shrieks that had faded into nothingness. The bloodline had been severed, and with it, the might of a family that had ruled for centuries. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within hours of the catastrophic events in the hall, the estate became a morgue. The servants, those who had survived the initial wave of chaos, scrambled to contain the damage, but there was nothing to be done. Sir Reginald was dead, along with half the guests in attendance, their bodies lying in grotesque poses, their faces contorted in agony. Those who remained alive were pale, weak, and incoherent, unable to stand or speak. They were shadows of their former selves, clinging to life in a cruel mockery of survival. Lord Alistair, the proud patriarch, had died in the midst of the chaos, his body found lying cold and unmoving in the very place where he had stood just hours before. His face, once full of arrogance and power, was now a twisted mask of horror, his mouth open as if to scream, but too late. His once great estate had been brought to ruin by the very blood that flowed through his veins. The servants, those who had not already fallen victim to the poison, began to scatter, running in all directions as if the manor itself had become a cursed place. The news spread quickly, a whisper carried by the wind. The Radcliffs had been cursed, their bloodline destroyed in a single night. The world had witnessed the end of a dynasty. But for Elira, it was only the beginning. The days that followed were filled with confusion and chaos. The estate was sealed off by the authorities, but no one could explain the deaths. There were rumors of a plague, a mysterious illness that had struck the noble family. But the truth was far more unsettling. No one knew who had done it. No one suspected the quiet slave girl, the one who had always stayed in the shadows, the one who had never been given a name. But there was one who knew. Lady Isabel, the bride, the one who had been spared the worst of it, but not untouched. She had been found in a dazed state, her clothes stained with blood, her eyes vacant. She had witnessed the entire thing. Her screams had echoed through the halls, but no one could comfort her. Her new life had ended before it had even begun, and she would never be the same again. As the weeks passed, rumors began to take root, whispers in the streets, the name Elira, spoken in hushed tones. She had vanished the night of the massacre, disappearing without a trace. Some said she had been caught, but no one ever saw her again. Some said she had escaped, fled into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Others believed that she had been taken by the authorities and cast into a dark cell, forgotten. But no one truly knew. The truth, like the poison, was elusive, leaving only a trail of unanswered questions. In the neighboring towns, stories spread like wildfire. Some claimed that Elira had been a witch, that she had cursed the Radcliffs with the power of her dark magic. Others believed she had been a servant of the devil, sent to exact his wrath on the family that had wronged her. But there were few who spoke her name with reverence. Most of the world had forgotten her long ago. Still, there was one undeniable truth. The Radcliffs were no more. Without their patriarch, without the strength of Lord Alistair to hold them together, the family quickly crumbled. The land was seized by creditors, the estate sold off to the highest bidder. The legacy of the Radcliffs, once so powerful, was nothing but a memory. The name itself faded from the records of the great families of England, replaced by whispers of their downfall. And what of Lady Isabel, the bride who had been caught in the crossfire of Elira's vengeance? Her family, once proud and wealthy, could not bear the shame. They tried to cover up the scandal, to erase the stain that had been left upon their name by the Radcliffe disaster. But the damage was done. The wedding, once intended to solidify an alliance between two great families, had instead marked the end of both. Isabel was never seen again, her fate lost to time and rumor. Some said she had been cast aside by her own family, locked away in a convent to live out her days in silence, the weight of the tragedy ever upon her shoulders. Others claimed she had taken her own life, unable to bear the crushing weight of the horrors she had witnessed on that fateful night. But the truth, like so many other details of the story, was never truly known. As for Elira, her name too became a part of legend. In the darkest corners of the kingdom, old women would whisper of the slave girl who had poisoned an entire bloodline, the girl who had taken vengeance not just for herself, but for all those who had been oppressed and silenced. To the common folk, she became a symbol of power, of retribution. A ghostly figure who stood against the tyranny of the rich, a figure who, in their eyes, had struck a blow for justice. And yet, despite the power of her revenge, something lingered in the air. The silence that followed the fall of the Radcliffs was not a silence of peace, but of something far darker. There were those who believed that Elira's actions had cursed not just the Radcliffe name, but the land itself. Some said that the manor had become haunted, that at night the spirits of the dead roamed its halls, calling out for vengeance. Others claimed that the very soil of the Radcliffe estate had become tainted, that nothing would ever grow there again. What was certain was that Elira had left a mark on history. Whether it was for justice or for something darker, no one could say. The winds had begun to change. The Radcliff estate, once the beating heart of the family's power, now lay in ruin. What was once a grand, sprawling manor surrounded by lush fields and orchards had crumbled into decay. The halls, once filled with the laughter of noble guests and the clinking of silver, now stood empty, silent except for the creaking of timbers and the whispers of time itself. The grand dining hall, where the last moments of the Radcliff bloodline had played out in tragic, horrifying detail, had been left to rot, its walls slowly bleeding into the earth beneath. No one dared to set foot on the estate anymore. The soil, once rich with life, was now barren. The plants refused to grow. The air was thick with a strange unease. Something dark had settled over the land, and it could not be shaken off. Those who lived nearby spoke of the place in hushed tones, avoiding it at all costs. And yet, the rumors endured. They still told the tale of the slave girl, Elira, the one who had poisoned the entire Radcliff family, bringing down a dynasty with the quiet fury of someone who had been overlooked for too long. Some believed she had escaped, fading into the mists of time, vanishing into the very shadows she had once lived in. Others said she had been caught, imprisoned, or even executed for her crimes. But no one truly knew for certain. There was one thing, however, that could not be denied. Elira had changed the world in a way no one had expected. She had taken her revenge not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been silenced, forgotten, or broken beneath the weight of others' power. And in doing so, she had become something more than a mere servant. She had become a legend. But even legends have their dark corners. Every few years, a traveler would pass through the ruined town nearby, always with the same question. "Is it true?" They would ask the old women who sat by the fires, their voices cracked with age. "The story of Elira and the Radcliffs, is it real?" The women would nod solemnly, their eyes heavy with the weight of the truth. They would whisper of the poison, of the desperate cries that had echoed through the manor on that fateful night, of the slow, suffocating deaths that had taken place while the stars above remained oblivious. They would speak of Elira with reverence, but also with fear, for even in their old age they could still feel the shadow of what she had done hanging over them. Others, though, would tell a different story. They spoke not of Elira's revenge, but of her curse. They claimed that her vengeance had twisted something deep within the earth, that it had left behind a stain that no prayer or blessing could cleanse, that the Radcliff bloodline, once tainted by greed and cruelty, had been eradicated. But the legacy of their suffering still lingered, forever tied to the land, and so the legend continued to grow. Every time the story was retold, it gained another layer, another whisper, until the truth became so obscured by folklore that no one could tell where the history ended and the myth began. But there was one final mystery, a question that haunted the few who still dared to speak of Elira. Had the bloodline truly been destroyed? Some claimed that deep within the manor's crumbling walls there had been a secret, a hidden room, an ancient chest, where the last of the Radcliff blood was stored, waiting to be awakened. It was said that the poison, though it had slain the patriarch and his heirs, had not taken every life. That somewhere in the darkness of the estate, a child had survived, a child whose blood ran thick with the same power that had once fueled the Radcliff name. Some believed the child had been hidden away, raised in secret, while others whispered that Elira had spared the last heir, that she had left one small thread of the bloodline to continue. Perhaps it was nothing more than a fantasy, a desperate hope for those who longed for a return to the power that had once been. But the stories persisted, like an ember smoldering in the ashes. Was it possible? Was there even now someone out there, someone bearing the name of Radcliff, waiting to rise from the ashes of their family west downfall? There were those who claimed to have seen strange figures in the ruins late at night, pale faces peering from broken windows, soft footsteps echoing through the halls, a child's laugh, faint and echoing from deep within the manor's corridors. But those who ventured too close, who sought to uncover the truth, never returned. They became part of the stories themselves, their bodies vanishing as though swallowed by the very earth they had come to search. The legend of Elira had become a tale of fear, of power, of secrets buried deep. It was no longer just the story of a girl who had exacted her revenge. It had grown into something else entirely, a tale of the unknown, of things that were better left untouched. And so, the mystery continued to haunt the town, the estate, and the very land itself. The story of the slave girl who had poisoned a bloodline at a wedding feast was no longer just a story. It was a shadow that hung over everything, an unanswered question, an unsolved riddle. Was Elira's vengeance truly complete? Had she wiped out the Radcliffs entirely? Or was there a dark twist still hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge? As the years passed, the only certainty was this: Elira's mark on the world would never fade. Whether through her curse or her triumph, her name, her legend, would continue to haunt the whispers of those who dared to speak it. And who knows? Perhaps one day, someone would return to the ruins of the Radcliff estate, seeking answers. And maybe, just maybe, they would find the truth waiting for them in the dark.